Welcome back to the Gardening with Joy and Holly radio show. Moments away, Melissa K. Norris, homesteader and author, will be with us. But first, a message from Rise Gardens.
Rise Gardens is a revolutionary hydroponic gardening system for your home. Instead of food traveling hundreds or even over 1,000 miles before it hits your plate, harvest the veggies, herbs, and greens you need for dinner tonight for the comfort of your home. No green thumb required knowledge. Gardening made easy with the Rise Gardens app. Step-by-step guidance from seed to harvest. A complete garden on a shelf, and it comes with everything you need to grow healthy and the freshest food for you and your loved ones. Fully customize your garden to your needs and preferences. For more information and get your Rise Garden, visit risegardens.com.
Holly, let's go to the hotline and bring in our guest for this week.
Melissa K. Norris helps hundreds of thousands of people each month raise their own food and create a homegrown and homemade kitchen, home garden, and barnyard through her website, popular Pioneering Today podcast, the Pioneering Today Academy, and her books. She's a co-founder of the Modern Homesteading Conference, as well as owner of Norris Farmstead. She is a fifth-generation homesteader and lives with her husband and 2 kids in their own little house in the big woods on the foothills of the northern Cascade Mountains. Welcome to the program, Melissa.
I am thrilled to be here with you.
Well, I thank you for taking time out of your day and not only about to educate myself and all of our listeners. And I'll start with this. Many people may hear the word homesteader and think of it in an old term mindset. What is a modern day homesteader, and can anybody be a modern day homesteader, or is there certain criteria you have to meet?
Yeah. Okay. I love this question because, yes, it is very much the modern part with the old fashioned part of homesteading, because in the United States, anyhow, there is no more Homestead Act where if we go and live on a piece of land for so many years and improve it, it becomes ours free and clear. You know, many of us wish that was still the case, but it's not. So with modern homesteading, it's taking a lot of those principles of being self-reliant or improving upon the land and providing for yourself with as little outside inputs really as was possible. And back in the context of homesteading in the 1800s and early 1900s in some states, you know, that was out of necessity. There wasn't anything around them for the most part for them to go to stores and buy stuff. So they really did have to be self-sufficient. But within the context of modern homesteading, I like to use this phrase, and I did not come up with it. In fact, I don't know who said it originally to give credit, but it's becoming more of a producer than you are a consumer. And so in that, anybody can practice modern homesteading, because most of us, even if we live in an apartment or, you know, in the suburbs of a house, we all have some type of kitchen. And so I really say starting in the kitchen and looking at what you are purchasing outside from. So for example, say you're buying bread. Well, you'll be making bread at home. And so instead of purchasing this already made thing, you'll be making an item from scratch. And I know technically you're still most likely buying the flour and the salt and the yeast or creating a sourdough starter in order to do that. But it's the act of producing more for yourself and consuming less. And that is going to be, everybody has a different starting point, you know, for where they're at right now on how they're going to do that. So I always say to start in the kitchen first, and then ideally start to grow a little bit of something. So first start making some homemade items and then see if you can actually start to grow some of that. And I know people who are in an apartment, they're, you know, like, how am I going to do that? You know, I don't even have a yard, but you can grow herbs on a sunny windowsill. If you have a patio, you know, you can do some container gardening. Maybe it's just a few tomato plants, a couple basil plants, you know, that type of thing. It's not going to be what you're going to be feeding, you know, your whole family's not going to be able to eat off of that for a year, but it's these baby steps. And you begin to look at everything in your life differently once you change and shift your mindset there.
Well, going back to the bread, yeah, you could buy it at the store, but have you ever looked at what the ingredients are in bread? When you're making it yourself, you're getting the raw ingredients and you know what's in it. Now, I say that, and Holly and I have looked at ingredients on things and said, wow, that's a lot of stuff. I don't know what that word is, but it's tasty anyway, and we serve it up anyway. We're all, you know, we all blame ourselves. We all do it. But getting back to that raw ingredients, knowing what's in it, that 5 ingredients that should be in it instead of the 15 that is.
Yeah, 100%. And that's a great way to start, is just start to evaluate what is it that you're consuming and buying from the store, and just start reading the ingredient list.
Oh, it's scary.
If you just start there, that will be motivation to start making some of those things from scratch, like you said, with kind of those base ingredients of things that we actually know what they are.
Yeah. Well, where is your passion come from to grow food? Did you figure that out later on in life, or was it something you were basically born into?
That is a great question. So I was born into a family where we did garden, and my dad always raised his own beef. And that was because he was self-employed and didn't have time to go and hunt. And so the beef was a sure thing. I know if you're
Right.
an awesome hunter, then hunting might be a sure thing for you. But here where we live, it wasn't a sure thing. But if he was raising the cows, we had a meat source, a protein source, and then we did a big vegetable garden. So in that aspect, I was born into it. I saw raising part of your own food was part of my upbringing. But then, I got married and moved out and was working full time, commuting actually as a pharmacy tech and commuting 18 miles one way. And it gets really hard to cook from scratch if you don't get home until 7 o'clock at night,
Right.
unless you want to eat, at 9 or 10 at night, which most of us don't. And so I really started to rely on, pre-bought items from the store where I was kind of assembling them at home and I might be throwing them in the oven, but it's not what I would truly call cooking from scratch or, with whole food ingredients. And my health really started to suffer. In fact, by the time I hit my late 20s, when my second child was born, I ended up having to go in and have my upper stomach and esophagus biopsied for cancer. And I didn't have cancer, which I'm very thankful for, but the results came back that I had a lot of erosion and I had cellular change. And cellular change is usually the precursor to precancerous cells. And so the specialist said, look, you have been on max doses of prescription medications to try to control the stomach acid. I had GERD and really bad stomach ulcers. And you shouldn't have been on them at these doses for as long as you have been. You have to come off of them. They're not even controlling your symptoms anyways. And you have to figure out by the food that you're eating how to control this, or the next time you come back into my office and we do this test, it's not going to be the same results. So that was a really huge motivation. I had small children at home, my husband, and like I said, at that time, it was 14 years ago, I was only in my late 20s and I wanted to be there when these kids, grew up, when they got married. And so I decided I was going to figure it out one way or the other. And so I just started diving into what was in the things. That's reading ingredient labels and realizing I have no idea what this is. I don't even know how to pronounce it, let alone what is it doing to my body. And so I kind of did a drastic where I threw everything out of the cupboard if I didn't know what the ingredient was, if it was a genetically modified ingredient, and had food dye in it. And I'll tell you what, at that point in time, that left very little food in my cupboard. And with that criteria, we've actually come a long way. There's a lot more available in the stores now than back then. I couldn't find it or I couldn't afford it. And so that meant we had to raise it. And so that was really the catalyst. We already did a garden and we were already raising our own beef, but that was the catalyst for us to massively producing a lot more of our own food. We started raising our own chickens for meat and eggs, as well as our own pork. And about 70% of the fruits and vegetables we actually raise now on our homestead that feeds our family for an entire year, and about 99% of our meat. And I say 99% because there's only so much bacon on one pig.
Right. Right. Well, you say that, and I'll lead into this. You've got a new book out called Everything Worth Preserving, The Complete Guide for Food Preservation. Tell us about the book, and did some of that history of your medical issues lead into this book as well, even though you're preserving and eating most of what you're growing most of what you're eating?
Yeah, 100%. Because here where I live in a northern Western Washington state, we actually have a very small growing season for warm weather crops. I can plant usually Memorial weekend, and then we can have frost come in mid-September. And so in order to grow all of those items for a year, I had to grow them in this short time period. And that meant I had to figure out a way to preserve them, because they aren't going to just last outside for us and we can't keep growing them. And so I wrote the book because I wanted a book that had not just canning, not just dehydrating, but all of the forms of food preservation in one book. And then I wanted all of the fruits and vegetables, as well as meats and proteins, where I could just flip alphabetically when I have, 20 pounds of asparagus, or I have a bunch of tomatoes or green beans coming in from the garden, and it would tell me exactly which ways that I could safely preserve that item at home. It would include the recipes. It would include all the how-tos, because I was still having to look this up or, reference like 5 different books. And I had all of these stacks of papers. And I'm like, my goodness, why can't all of this be in one book? And I couldn't find it. So I wrote it for myself, knowing that other people needed the exact same thing and that ease that I did. And that's how the book was born.
I see. Yeah. Well, I've got 40 pounds of tomatoes. How much does this make, or how much could possibly? It's hard to find any of that information out there.
Yeah.
Well, you talked about preserving there. I'll jump into this. What are some very common canning mistakes you see people make, and how can they easily avoid them?
Yeah, the biggest thing I see with canning mistakes that people make is they try to shortcut the process because we've kind of been trained to look for the hacks or the easy button in today's society. Everybody wants that quick fix. But when it comes to canning, there are very specific steps and the ingredients in the recipes that have been formulated in order to keep it safe so that you don't get botulism,
Right.
which is most people, if they've looked into canning at all, they've kind of heard that. And so it's a low acidic food, meaning it is 4.7 or higher on the pH scale, because the higher you go on the pH scale, actually the lower in acidity an item is. Then it has to be pressure canned in order to reach high enough temperatures to kill botulism spores if they're present. And so you can't reach those temperatures in boiling water, for example, for water bath, like you can do pickles and jams and jellies. And so if a food is 4.6 on the pH scale or lower, meaning high in acid, then you can safely water bath can those items because botulism doesn't grow in an acidic environment, specifically 4.6 or lower on the pH scale. And so I see a lot of people are like, well, I'm just going to boil my jars of green beans for 3 hours instead of put them in a pressure canner. Well, boiling water only reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Doesn't matter if you boil it for 10 minutes or 3 hours. It doesn't ever get beyond that temperature point. And so understanding that and using the proper canner for the acidity of the food is really important. Not trying to can in the oven. Dry heat is not the same as wet heat, which you get when you're using a water bath canner or, for example, a pressure canner because you have the steam, that heat penetration going through. So don't try to cheat, so to speak, when it comes to canning. Those canning recipes are really there and have been formulated and tested for safety. And I like to say, when I'm baking and cooking, recipes are a guideline. When it comes to canning, they're not a guideline. You really need to make sure that you're following those recipes exactly, both in ratios and amounts of ingredients, and then also in processing times and methods.
Because when you're pressure canning, inside of that pressure canner, you can get upwards of 280, 300, and a lot of things are happening in there, making things safe, so you don't have to be concerned if you're going to die when you eat those canned goods.
Yeah, because you're 10 pounds of pressure, which if you are 1,000 feet or lower, then you're going to hit about 248 degrees Fahrenheit during the processing time. And then if you are at higher altitude, so 1,001 feet above sea level, then you're going to increase that to 15 pounds of pressure when it comes to pressure canning. And you're going to still be getting that same temperature, of course, but it's your altitude that's requiring you to put those larger amounts of pressure, pounds of pressure on there in order to reach those same temperatures.
And then the other thing that we have found, I don't know if you've seen it on social media, the vinegar now in some brands have dropped to 4% instead of the 5% that it used to be.
Yes, I have been seeing that. I have not personally seen that in the brands that I use, but I have seen some people have been sharing that. And I'm really glad you brought that point up, because when it comes to pickling recipes for canning, just using a pickle recipe that may be a refrigerator pickle recipe and canning recipes are different. And older canning books about 1996, if you're using older canning books, it's best to get an updated book. And the reason for that is because older canning recipes, and therefore older canning books, vinegar actually used to be the standard was 7%. And then we moved to 5%. It's been few decades back now. But that's why in older canning recipes, oftentimes you would see the brine ratio where you would have higher amounts of water than you would vinegar. And so anytime you're canning now and you're doing a pickling recipe where you're taking vegetables that aren't acidic like fruit, we can safely can those in a water bath if we are doing them with vinegar and adding that acid in. It needs to be a minimum of equal parts 5% vinegar, as you said, and equal parts water. So if you have a canning recipe that's maybe been handed down in your family, or using some older books or a website online or something like that, and you see where it's more water than it is vinegar, that is not a safe and updated pickle recipe for canning.
Well, I'll ask you this. You spoke about you growing up on a homestead, but your spouse did not. What are some advice you can give to those couples or soon-to-be couples or maybe soon-to-be couples that have that opposite background to get them both aligned, saying, hey, maybe this is the best way to move forward with our marriage or relationship by growing food and potentially building a homestead together?
Yeah, I think it's just being very, very clear with your why, like what your motivation is, because sometimes with anything, not just with homesteading, but if you go to your family and say, we're not going to do X, Y, Z anymore, that kind of just feels like an ultimatum. But if you explain to them why this is so important to me, the reasons that you want to, like some of the things that are wrong when you look at the food that we're buying from the store and the way that it's raised and the impact that it has, and all those different things. Whatever your main reason is, it might be your health, like me. Maybe you have health issues and you're like, I really want to make sure that we are healthy so that we can be here for one another. And I want to start growing our own food in order to be able to do that. When you present something that way, like it's because I really care about us and I care about our future, that brings people on board in a very different way than saying we're just going to do this or we're not going to do this and that type of thing. So I would say be very open in your communication, but really getting back to that why and the benefit part of it. And then starting with small, which may sound funny because we raise such a large part of our food, but you definitely don't want to overwhelm yourself, because this should be ideally a lifestyle that you live forevermore. And if you burn yourself out the first season because you try to do way too much and it's not a part of your normal life and it's all new, the likelihood of you continuing to do it is going to go down. So picking what feels doable for you and getting your spouse or even the kids on board, and then looking at what it is specifically with gardening and raising, like what are some of your guys' favorite things to eat or foods, and start by growing the things that are already enjoyed and liked in your family, or something that you use in dishes that are favorite dishes, rather than just, putting in whatever because you see maybe your neighbor Joe down the street, or you saw somebody on Instagram said, we love Swiss chard, yet you've never even cooked Swiss chard before and you have no idea if anybody likes it. Really starting kind of from a practical standpoint.
Well, also then it's going to be a little work up front, but look of basically a rough number, how much we're going to save without having to buy all this stuff, because it'll pay for itself. Canning jars pay for themselves very quickly, year after year. That type of mindset as well.
Do. So really it comes down to flavor, because the first time you experience a vegetable or a fruit that has been homegrown, allowed to fully ripen and develop on the vine and picked at peak freshness, it is amazing how much different food tastes. I mean, tomatoes are actually flavorful. Strawberries are sweet. In fact, it's funny. My kids have always been raised on homegrown green beans. And if we go to a restaurant or someone else's house, when they were little, they love green beans at home, but they could taste the difference. And they're like, Mama, I don't like these. They don't taste right. And because they didn't have the flavor depth. And so just the flavor alone will have you sticking to raising your own vegetables.
Well, we thank you for the time you've offered us, Melissa. How can people find more about you and find not only the book you just put out, Everything Worth Preserving, but your other ones as well?
Yeah, melissaknorris.com, which is my website. You can find all of my books. There's hundreds of articles with videos and step-by-step tutorials, as well as links to the podcast. So whatever your mode of learning is, if it's reading, if it's listening, or if it's watching, I've got you covered.
Well, Melissa, thank you very much for being part of the program and the information you've shared with all of us.
Thanks so much for having me on, Joey.
Absolutely.
For more information, please visit thewisconsinvegetablegardener.com.